happened when you finally stood up to your toxic family? I had just woken up from my emergency C-section when I learned that my sister changed the baby's name while I was unconscious. What stung most is I couldn't even do anything. She was the real mother, as she called it, while I was just the surrogate. But she promised to name the baby after me to honor my sacrifice. I died during childbirth and had to be resuscitated before the C-section. And even prior to that, I'd had enough complications to where my body was damaged for life. Still, I was happy to give my sister the child she wanted. After 3 days of no visits, I got discharged. And the first thing I did was text if the baby was okay, and could I still be the godmother. It was the only thing I wanted. Of course, sis will make it official when you come over, but not this weekend, maybe next. For 6 weeks, I begged to see baby Kyle. Finally, my sister Mia texted, "Come to mom's for Sunday dinner. We'll do the godmother ceremony then, 3 p.m. I spent my last $50 on a silver rattle and practiced my godmother speech in the mirror. Sunday morning, I woke up at 5 a.m., too excited to sleep any longer, and spent 3 hours getting ready despite the pain shooting through my abdomen with every movement. I curled my hair for the first time since before the pregnancy and put on the only dress that fit over my still swollen belly. Driving over, I called mom to ask what dessert to bring since I'd already bought ingredients for her favorite lemon bars, but her number was disconnected. Strange, but maybe she forgot to pay the bill again. I tried Mia next and got an automated message that I'd been blocked. My chest tightened as I pulled over on the highway shoulder, cars whizzing past while I called Dad, then my cousins, then Aunt Carol. Every single number either blocked or disconnected, like I'd been surgically removed from the family tree. When I got to mom's house, her prized rose bushes were already browning from 2 weeks without water. Through the mail slot, I could see furniture draped in white sheets like. I drove to Mia's apartment. There, I found a young couple touring it with the landlord who recognized me from previous visits. "Oh, are you Helen? Mia left something for you," he said, handing me an envelope with my name in Mia's handwriting. Inside was a check for $5,000 and a note. "For the medical bills. This makes us even. Please don't contact us." The check bounced 3 days later, and through a fake Instagram, I discovered they'd moved to Seattle, where Kyle had already been christened with mom holding him and some stranger labeled as his godmother. I looked at my scar in the mirror that night, a permanent reminder of how my family ruined my life. 8 months later, after I'd accepted that my family had used me as a free incubator, an insurance investigator called. You see, after I gave birth, I was billed $547,000, but I had insurance. The insurance did what they do best and started looking for any excuse not to pay it. They opened an investigation, and this call was the fruits of that investigation. "We found something interesting in our review," the woman said. "Your sister had genetic testing done 6 months before the pregnancy showing positive for factor V Leiden, but she marked no family history on the fertility clinic forms." My legs gave out. I told her I was unaware of any family medical history. That's when her voice turned serious. "This is fraud. We're going after the full amount." I started making calls to doctors immediately. I managed to get tests in, and that's how I found it. I had factor V Leiden, a blood clotting disorder that makes giving birth basically a death sentence. The investigator's words rung in my ear. I instantly realized Mia had known I would likely die during childbirth, but she didn't care. She just wanted her baby. I called the insurance company back, and they informed me that it was still fraud, but they would be directing their attention to Mia. Well, so was I. A lawyer took my case pro bono. We filed civil suits and criminal charges. The insurance company went after her for $547,000, while I went after her for attempted murder. And Mia's perfect Seattle life started crumbling faster than she could post inspirational quotes about motherhood. Child services moved fast and found Mia's boyfriend dealing drugs out of their Seattle apartment. The photos they sent me during the emergency removal showed Kyle at 11 months old in a filthy onesie, with empty bottles scattered around a bare mattress on the floor, and the $2,000 stroller I'd bought them being used to store drug money. Mia called me for the first time since she'd disappeared, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. "Please don't do this. He's my son." I hung up on her mid-sentence. 4 months of paperwork followed, and finally, the call came that I could pick Kyle up. I flew to Seattle with an empty car seat and a heart so full it hurt. When the social worker brought him out, Kyle was screaming for his mama and thrashing in her arms. This beautiful boy I'd felt kick inside me for months but had never held. He didn't recognize me at all, just another stranger in a long line of strangers. But I was determined to make him my own, and for 7 years I did. I fed him, cleaned him, played peekaboo. Mia was paying me back the $350,000 the court determined she owed me. But then one Thursday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Kyle standing there with his backpack, tears streaming down his face as he clutched printed photos. "Why did you lie to me?" he asked. I froze because he should have been at school. "Open. The lady at the fence told me you stole me from my real mom." I stared at him, not knowing what to say, but knowing that my sister was back. The photos in Kyle's small hands were shaking as I reached for them, noticing his backpack strap was torn and hanging loose. Fresh red scratches ran down both his arms like he'd been grabbed hard and pulled through something rough. My heart slammed against my ribs as I looked at the photos showing Mia holding baby Kyle in what looked like a nice apartment, everything cropped perfectly to hide the filth I remembered from the police photos. I knelt down slowly and tried to take them, but Kyle jerked back, his face twisted with confusion and anger I'd never seen before. "That lady hurt you?" I asked, but he pulled away harder, demanding to know why I stole him from his real mom. My hands were already dialing the school while Kyle stood frozen in our doorway, his shoes still muddy from wherever she'd taken him. The secretary answered on the third ring, and I asked why Kyle was dismissed early without calling me first. She went quiet for a moment, then started apologizing, explaining that a woman claiming to be his aunt Lila Smith Morrison had shown up with official-looking court papers and proper ID. The woman had waited by the playground fence for weeks apparently, and Kyle had waved at her before, so they thought it was fine. My legs went weak as I hung up and immediately dialed 911, explaining that my sister had taken Kyle from school with fake documents. The operator listened, then told me that since Mia was his biological mother and Kyle wasn't physically harmed, this was a civil matter for family court. 2 hours later, Kyle sat at our kitchen table with his mac and cheese getting cold while I used my phone to photograph every scratch and mark on his arms. He kept asking why I never told him about his real mom, why I lied, why I took him away from her. Each question felt like a knife twisting deeper, as I tried to explain in ways a 7-year-old could understand. That night, I sat on the floor outside his bedroom door listening to him cry himself to sleep, my C-section scar burning with phantom pain from the stress. I pulled out my laptop and searched for Lila Johnson Morrison, but found only a Facebook profile created 2 weeks ago with no friends, just photos of Mia at different ages. The next morning, I kept Kyle home and called Nathan Cross, the lawyer who'd helped me get custody party 7 years ago. He answered on the second ring, and I explained everything that happened, how Mia had made contact despite the restraining order. He scheduled an emergency hearing, but warned it would take at least 2 weeks to get before a judge. After hanging up, I checked Kyle's school tablet and found messages from a Mommy Mia 2024 account going back 3 weeks. The messages were full of promises about Disney trips, new toys, a big house with a pool, and the truth about what Aunt Helen did to our family. She'd been messaging him during recess when teachers weren't watching, telling him she loved him and missed him every single day. I drove Kyle to his pediatrician that afternoon to document the injuries, but when the doctor asked what happened, Kyle said he fell at recess. The doctor looked at me with concern while making notes in Kyle's file about sudden behavioral changes and conflicting stories about injuries. 3 days later, I noticed a silver Honda following us to the grocery store, always staying exactly 3 cars behind no matter how I changed lanes. I tested it by taking a weird route home through side streets I never used, and the car followed every single turn. When I pulled into the police station parking lot, the Honda sped past without stopping, but I knew this was just the beginning. Nathan came to my apartment the next morning with a stack of papers and told me we needed to file an emergency motion right away. We drove to the courthouse together, and while he filled out forms at the clerk's desk, I watched other families waiting for their hearings. The clerk looked at our paperwork and said, Judge Patricia Vance had an opening in 10 days, but warned us that biological parent rights were complicated even with all our evidence. That afternoon, Kyle's teacher called, and her voice sounded worried when she asked if I could come in for a meeting. She said Kyle had been telling his classmates that his real mom was coming to get him soon, and he refused to make a Mother's Day card because I wasn't his real mother. I'm trying to understand the timeline here. So Helen carried the baby for Mia, almost died. Then Mia disappeared with Kyle for months before losing him to Helen. The school counselor wanted to see me the next morning, so I barely slept that night thinking about what this meant. When I got to the counselor's office, she had papers spread across her desk, and I could see Kyle's drawings before she even started talking. He'd drawn 2 houses, one labeled fake home with stick figures that looked like us, and another labeled real home with a woman he'd never actually lived with. The counselor showed me more drawings where Kyle had written things like my real family and going home soon in his shaky handwriting. She recommended immediate therapy, but said the wait list was 6 weeks long and gave me some pamphlets about childhood trauma that I threw in the trash on my way out. 2 days later, a FedEx truck pulled up and the driver handed me an envelope that required my signature. Inside was a formal letter from a Seattle law firm with fancy letterhead claiming I'd obtained custody through fraudulent means and demanding Kyle's immediate return. The letter said Mia had completed rehab and remarried a successful businessman named Robert Williams Morrison, who could provide Kyle with opportunities I never could. My hands shook so bad I dropped the papers, and Nathan found me on my kitchen floor 20 minutes later, still trying to pick them up. He took the letter and started making calls while I sat there feeling like the walls were closing in. 5 days before our hearing, Nathan called me at midnight because he'd been researching all evening and couldn't find any Robert Brown Morrison in any database anywhere. But he did find something else. A woman named Lila Brown Morrison had been establishing herself as Kyle's aunt for months through various legal documents. The whole thing was planned and elaborate with fake addresses and phone numbers that all checked out at first glance. That same night, I heard Kyle moving around in his room and found him packing his favorite toys into his backpack. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was getting ready for when he goes to his real home. I sat on his bed and held him while he explained that the woman at the fence promised him a puppy and his own room with a TV and video games. He said she told him I was just watching him for a while, but now it was time to go back where he belonged. The next week at Kyle's soccer practice, I saw the silver Honda in the parking lot and watched as a woman got out and started talking to other parents. She introduced herself as Kyle's aunt and mentioned she was concerned about my mental state since the traumatic birth, and several parents started looking at me differently. One mom actually moved her chair away from me, and another pulled her kid aside when he tried to talk to Kyle. Nathan managed to subpoena records from the rehab facility Mia supposedly completed and discovered she was discharged after only 12 days for non-compliance. The successful businessman husband turned out to be Derek Lawson, who was recently released from prison for fraud and identity theft. But even with this information, the damage was already being done to my reputation at Kyle's school. During recess 3 days later, Kyle disappeared, and a teacher found him 2 blocks away, walking toward the silver Honda that was parked right along his path. The principal called me in and said they were implementing a safety plan that required me to personally walk Kyle to his classroom every morning. She looked at me like I was the problem, while explaining that Kyle seemed confused about his living situation. The other parents whispered when they saw me walking him in, and I heard one say something about custody battles being hard on kids. 2 days before our hearing, a court-appointed psychologist named Dr. Rachel Simmons came to evaluate Kyle and made me wait in the hallway. Through the door, I could hear Kyle saying he wanted to meet his real family and that I scared him sometimes. The words sounded rehearsed and wrong coming from him, but Dr. Simmons kept writing on her notepad. When she came out, she wouldn't look me in the eye and just said her report would be ready for the judge. That night, I went to tuck Kyle in and noticed his blanket looked lumpy near his pillow. I lifted it and found a cheap prepaid phone hidden underneath with the screen still glowing. My hands shook as I picked it up and saw the call history showing dozens of calls to a Seattle number, some lasting over an hour while I thought he was sleeping. The most recent call was from 20 minutes ago, and when I scrolled through the texts, I saw Mia had been telling him I wasn't his real mom and that she was coming to save him. I put the phone back and walked to my room feeling like the floor might give out under me. The next morning, I called Nathan and told him about the phone, but he said unless we could prove Mia sent it, there wasn't much we could do. 3 days before the hearing, I was making lunch when the doorbell rang, and through the peephole, I saw Mia standing there with a woman I didn't recognize. I opened the door just a crack, and Mia immediately started yelling that she wanted to see her son. The woman next to her, who she called Lila, held up her phone recording everything while Mia screamed loud enough for all the neighbors to hear that I was keeping a mother from her child. I tried to close the door, but Mia stuck her foot in it and kept yelling about how I stole her baby, while several neighbors came out with their phones recording the whole scene. I finally managed to shut the door and called the police, but by the time they arrived, Mia and Lila were gone, and the damage was done. Nathan came over that afternoon to prep me for court, and his face was grim as he explained that Judge Patricia had a reputation for favoring biological parents. He warned me that Mia's lawyer would paint me as someone who manipulated my sister during a vulnerable time, and that my medical records from the traumatic birth could make me look unstable. The morning of the hearing, Kyle locked himself in his room and refused to come out. I stood outside his door begging him to get dressed while he screamed that he hated me and wanted his real mom. When I finally got the door open, he was sitting on his bed in his pajamas with tears streaming running down his face. I tried to hug him, but he pushed me away and screamed the words I knew Mia had taught him to say. The drive to the courthouse was silent except for Kyle's sniffling in the back seat. Inside the courtroom, Mia looked like a completely different person in a conservative dress suit with her hair pulled back and subtle makeup. She sat holding hands with a man in an expensive suit who her lawyer introduced as Robert, her husband. When the proceedings started, Mia cried softly while her lawyer described a recovering mother desperate to reunite with her stolen child and showed photos of a beautiful nursery she'd prepared in their new home. Judge Patricia listened with obvious sympathy, nodding along as Mia's lawyer talked about the sacred bond between mother and child. My lawyer tried to explain the abandonment and the fraud, but Patricia kept interrupting to ask about my medical issues and whether I was physically capable of caring for an active child. After 2 hours of testimony, Patricia ordered a full custody evaluation over the next 60 days with supervised visitation starting immediately. Kyle's face lit up when he heard he'd get to see Mia twice a week for 2 hours at a neutral location, and I felt another piece of my heart break. 3 days later, I sat in my car outside the visitation center listening to Kyle laugh with Mia through the open window. It was a sound I hadn't heard from him in weeks, and it hurt more than I expected. The supervisor came out after the visit and made notes on her clipboard about how comfortable Kyle seemed with his biological mother. Nathan called me that evening with news he'd been digging into Robert's background. He'd discovered that Robert was actually Derek, Mia's former dealer who'd become her boyfriend, and their marriage certificate looked forged. The problem was, without concrete proof of the forgery, the court wouldn't accept it as evidence, and the detective Nathan hired needed more time. After the third visitation, Kyle came home wearing a designer jacket and carrying a bag full of expensive toys. He told me Mommy Mia said he didn't have to follow my rules anymore because soon everything would be different. When I asked him to do his homework, he threw his new tablet at the wall and said his real mom didn't believe in forcing kids to do things they didn't want to do. The next day, Rachel came back for her second evaluation, and this time she insisted I be present. Kyle sat across from us repeating rehearsed lines about feeling unsafe and confused with me, while Rachel wrote page after page of notes. He said he was scared I would hurt him like I hurt his real mom, and that he just wanted to be with his real family. Every word was perfectly delivered, and I could see Rachel believed every bit of it. After the evaluation ended, I drove Kyle home in silence while he stared out the window, refusing to look at me. That night, I was cleaning his room when I found something that made my stomach drop. Under his bed was a Seattle school brochure with a sticky note in Mia's handwriting that said, "Your new school sweetie," along with a brand new uniform still in the bag with tags showing she'd bought it 3 weeks ago. The uniform had Kyle's name embroidered on it and everything. I took photos of everything and sent them to Nathan, who called me back within minutes saying this was a clear violation of the custody agreement since she couldn't enroll him anywhere without court permission. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making breakfast, and it was Kyle's principal asking if I could come in immediately. When I got there, she showed me security footage from the day before of a woman who'd tried to pick Kyle up claiming to be his authorized guardian with paperwork and everything. Kyle drawing those pictures really makes me wonder, how long has someone been telling him these things about having a real home somewhere else? The woman had argued with the front desk staff for 20 minutes before leaving, but what scared me most was she knew exactly which classroom was Kyle's and had asked for him by his teacher's name. The principal said the woman had called herself Lila Miller Morrison and showed documents that looked official, but something felt off, so they'd refused to release Kyle. I recognized her from the footage, even with the sunglasses and different hair color, because it was the same woman from the park who'd been talking to Kyle. Nathan filed an emergency motion about the attempted pickup and the forged enrollment documents, but at the hearing, Mia's lawyer Robert claimed it was all a misunderstanding and that I was being paranoid and trying to alienate Kyle from his real mother. The judge warned both of us about making inflammatory accusations without solid proof and said she wouldn't tolerate any more drama in her courtroom. 2 days later, when I picked Kyle up from his visitation, he was crying and shaking, and as soon as we got in the car, he started screaming at me, asking why I killed his grandmother. He said Mia told him that I wouldn't let Grandma see him before she died, and that's why she got so sad she had a heart attack and it was all my fault. I tried to explain that my mom was still alive and living in Florida, but Kyle just kept saying I was a liar and a murderer and he hated me. The thing is, my mom really had moved to Florida, but she was perfectly healthy, and I'd just talked to her the week before, but Kyle wouldn't believe me even when I tried to call her right there in the car. That whole week, Kyle barely spoke to me and spent most of his time in his room, so when I went to change his sheets, I wasn't prepared for what I found. Under his bed were dozens of drawings he'd made, and they made my blood run cold. There were pictures of me with devil horns and red eyes holding a knife with titles like The Liar and Evil Helen, while Mia had angel wings and a halo in every picture with titles like My Real Mom and The Good One. Some drawings showed me in a cage or behind bars, while others showed him and Mia and Derek living in a big house with a dog and a pool. I took photos of everything but felt completely helpless because his therapist appointment wasn't for another month, and the court evaluator would probably just say he was expressing his feelings through art. The next day, my neighbor Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door and asked if everything was okay because she'd been getting weird phone calls. Someone claiming to be a social worker had called her 3 times asking detailed questions about me, like what time I left for work and came home and whether I ever seemed unstable or angry around Kyle. The caller had asked if she'd ever heard yelling from our apartment or seen me drinking or bringing strange men home, and wanted to know if Kyle ever looked hungry or dirty. Mrs. Patterson said she told them I was a wonderful mother, but the calls made her uncomfortable, so she wanted to warn me. I thanked her and immediately called Nathan, who said his investigator had been digging into this Lila person and had just discovered something huge. Turns out Lila Miller Morrison was actually Derek's sister, Lisa Lawson, who'd just gotten out of prison 6 months ago for identity theft and fraud. The investigator had photos of her with Derek from his social media before she went to prison, and the resemblance was obvious once you knew to look for it. But when they tried to serve her with papers at the address she'd given the school, she'd already disappeared, and when Nathan confronted Mia about it in court, she claimed she didn't know anyone named Lisa Lawson and had never heard of Lila either. The judge said without proof of connection, we couldn't make accusations, but I knew Mia was lying because I'd seen them together at the park. A few days later, Rachel called saying she needed my medical records from Kyle's birth, specifically anything about my death and resuscitation during the emergency C-section. She said it was routine, but I could tell from her voice it wasn't, and that's when I realized what Mia was doing. She was going to use my near-death experience to claim I had PTSD or brain damage that made me an unfit guardian for Kyle. Nathan confirmed my suspicions when he said Mia's lawyer had filed a motion requesting a full psychological evaluation of me based on my traumatic birth experience. That night I couldn't sleep, so I went through all the old videos on my phone from when Kyle first came to live with me. me. There he was at 11 months old, screaming in terror when I tried to hold him, then slowly over weeks and months learning to trust me. Videos of his first steps in my living room, and his first word, which was no, and the first time he let me hold him without crying, which took 3 months. I wrote a long letter to the judge about those early days when I'd stayed up all night with him through nightmares and feeding issues, and how he'd been so delayed from neglect that he couldn't even sit up properly at almost a year old. I wrote about the therapy appointments and the special exercises, and the way he'd finally smiled at me after 4 months, and how that smile made everything worth it. I knew the letter might never get read, but I had to try something. The next week at the visitation exchange, Derek was standing by Mia's car, and as I walked Kyle over, he moved toward me fast. He bumped into me hard enough to knock me to the ground, and my knee hit the pavement so hard I saw stars. He immediately reached down to help me up while apologizing loudly about how clumsy he was, and how he didn't see me there, and was I okay, did I need help? Other parents were watching, and some looked concerned, but from their angle, it probably looked like an accident, especially since Derek was being so helpful and apologetic. But while he was helping me up, he whispered that this was nothing compared to what would happen if I didn't give up Kyle voluntarily. My legs shook all the way to the car, and I sat there for 20 minutes before I could drive home. 6 days later, Nathan called me into his office and pulled out a small USB drive that someone had slipped under his door that morning. He plugged it into his laptop, and I heard Mia's voice clear as day telling Kyle exactly what to say to Rachel, promising him a new bike if he said he was scared of me, and a trip to Disneyland if he cried during the interview. Nathan shook his head and explained we couldn't use it in court without proving who recorded it and how they got it, but at least we knew what we were dealing with. That same week, Kyle started wetting the bed every single night, something he hadn't done since he was 3, and I'd hear him crying my name in his sleep, but when I went to comfort him, he'd push me away and scream that I wasn't his real mom. Rachel came by for her weekly observation and wrote in her notebook while Kyle had another accident right in front of her. Then she asked me if there had been any changes in the household that might be causing this stress. I wanted to scream that his mother was poisoning him against me, but I just shook my head and changed his sheets for the 3rd time that day. 2 days later, Kyle came home from his supervised visit with Mia and asked me why I didn't die like I was supposed to when he was born. My blood went cold as he explained that mommy told him God wanted her to have him, but I was selfish and stayed alive even though I wasn't supposed to, that I stole him from heaven's plan. He looked at me with such confusion and hurt, like I was some kind of monster who cheated death just to take him away from his real mother. Nathan called me the next morning and his voice was heavy when he said Rachel's preliminary report was recommending reunification with the biological mother based on Kyle's clear preference and Mia's remarkable recovery from her past issues. The final report would be submitted in 2 weeks and would likely determine the judge's decision, and we both knew what that meant, even though neither of us said it out loud. The following Saturday at Kyle's soccer game, I noticed Lila back again, this time with a man holding a professional camera who introduced himself as a documentary filmmaker interested in custody disputes where children are kept from their biological parents. They started filming me without asking, and went around to other parents asking if they'd noticed any concerning behavior from me, if Kyle seemed happy, if they'd seen any signs of abuse or neglect. Most parents walked away uncomfortable, but a few answered their questions while looking at me sideways, and I could feel the narrative being built around me like a cage. Nathan's investigator finally tracked down a woman named Sharon who lived next to Mia in Seattle, and she had photos from just 6 months ago showing the apartment building with a condemned notice and police tape, not the years ago that Mia claimed she'd gotten clean. Sharon was terrified to testify because she'd seen Derek's friends come and go at all hours and knew what they were capable of, but she gave us copies of the photos and her contact information in case she changed her mind. The next supervised visit was the worst yet when Kyle told me he didn't want to come home anymore, that Mia promised the bad judge would see the truth and he could live with her forever. I reached out to hug him goodbye like I always did, but he screamed, "Don't touch me," so loud that everyone in the visitation center turned to stare, and the supervisor immediately started writing in her report. 3 days later, the school principal called to tell me Kyle had been showing his classmates bruises from soccer practice and telling them I hit him, that I was mean and scary, and he wanted to live with his real mom. The principal had no choice but to report it to Child Protective Services, and they would be opening an investigation immediately, which meant another layer of scrutiny on top of everything else. What makes someone teach a 5-year-old to say such dark things about dying? The way Kyle asked why Helen didn't die when she was supposed to. That's such a heavy thought for a little kid to carry around. I made an appointment with a therapist for the first time since I'd gotten Kyle, because I needed someone to document my mental state before Mia twisted it into something else. I sat in that beige office and sobbed for 40 minutes about how I was going to lose the boy I'd raised for 7 years, how I'd given up my body and my family to bring him into this world only to have him ripped away by the same person who left me to die. The therapist wrote that I was showing appropriate grief responses to an extraordinarily difficult situation, but we both knew those words could be twisted into emotional instability in the wrong hands. 2 mornings later, the doorbell rang at 7 a.m., and I opened it to find a CPS investigator with a clipboard asking to see Kyle's living conditions. She walked straight to his room, which looked like a tornado had hit it, because just an hour earlier, I'd asked him to clean up, and he'd responded by throwing every toy he owned across the floor and screaming that his real mom never made him clean. The investigator took photos of the mess while asking Kyle if this was how his room usually looked, and he nodded, saying I never helped him clean, and got mad when he asked for help. The timing was too perfect, too orchestrated, and I realized Mia must have known exactly when to trigger Kyle's meltdown to coincide with the investigation. Nathan called me 2 days later while I was scrubbing Kyle's handprints off the kitchen wall. His voice was tight as he explained what his private investigator had found about Derek. 2 arrests in the past 6 months, 1 for assault and 1 for possession. Both times the charges got dropped on technicalities, something about improper search procedures and witness issues. The worst part was we couldn't even use this information in court. Nathan explained that criminal records from ongoing cases were inadmissible in family court unless there was a conviction. I threw my phone against the wall so hard the screen cracked. The next week dragged by with Kyle barely speaking to me except to ask when he'd see mommy again. Then Rachel's report arrived by email while I was at work. I read it in the bathroom stall, my hands shaking as each word cut deeper. She recommended gradual transition to biological mother's custody, citing Kyle's clear preference and what she called my possessive attachment. The phrases blurred together as tears dropped onto my phone screen. Emotional codependency, unhealthy enmeshment, failure to support reunification. She made 7 years of love sound like a crime. I vomited in the toilet and had to leave work early. Nathan had been working on getting the Seattle neighbor to testify about what she'd seen at Mia's apartment. She finally agreed to a video deposition after weeks of convincing. I watched from Nathan's office as she started describing the drug deals and the neglect. Then her phone rang during the recording. Her face went white as she listened, and when she came back on screen, she claimed she'd been confused. She didn't really see anything illegal. Maybe it was just friends visiting. Nathan slammed his laptop shut, knowing Derek had gotten to her, but having no way to prove it. That night, I found Kyle at the kitchen table writing something in his best handwriting. When I asked what it was, he covered it with his arm, but I saw enough. Dear Santa, I want my real family for Christmas, and for Aunt Helen not to be sad when I go. Even while breaking my heart, traces of the sweet boy I'd raised were still there. I went to my room and sobbed into my pillow until I couldn't breathe. 3 days later, Mia's lawyer filed an emergency motion. The papers claimed I was mentally deteriorating and Kyle was in immediate danger. They'd attached photos from that documentary filmmaker showing me at Kyle's soccer practice looking exhausted with my hair unwashed and bags under my eyes. Patricia scheduled an emergency hearing for 48 hours later. I spent those 2 days trying to make myself look put together while Kyle watched me with guilty eyes. The emergency hearing was held in a smaller courtroom that smelled like old coffee and desperation. Nathan presented the evidence about Derek's arrests, laying out the police reports and booking photos. Mia's lawyer stood up immediately, arguing it was completely irrelevant since Derek wasn't seeking custody. Only Mia was asking for custody, and Derek was just her boyfriend. Patricia looked frustrated, rubbing her temples as she warned both sides to focus on Kyle's best interests instead of mudslinging. Then she called Kyle into her chambers alone. He walked past me without looking up, his small shoulders rigid with tension. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours as I sat there imagining what lies he was telling. When the door opened, Kyle came out staring at the floor while Patricia announced her decision. She was ordering immediate overnight visitations with Mia pending the final hearing next week. My lawyer squeezed my hand to keep me from crying out. The first overnight visit was scheduled for Friday. Kyle packed his backpack Thursday night, carefully folding his favorite Pokemon shirt and his stuffed dinosaur. He looked at me while zipping it up and said, Mommy told him he didn't have to come back if he didn't want to. I helped him pack his toothbrush, knowing I might never see these things again. He hugged me at the door, quick and light like he was already practicing letting go. Saturday afternoon, he came back different. I noticed the bruise immediately, purple and green spreading across his left eye. He said he fell off a bike before I could even ask. I took photos with my phone, my hands trembling as I documented the injury. When I called Nathan to report it, Kyle started screaming that I was lying. He said I gave him the bruise, that I hit him because I was mad about the visits. The words came out rehearsed and mechanical, but he said them loud enough for Nathan to hear through the phone. I knew then that Mia had coached him on exactly what to say if he got hurt. 3 days later, Nathan called me with news from the forensic accountant he'd hired. The guy had spent weeks digging through financial records and found that Mia hadn't paid a single penny of the $350,000 she owed me from the court order 7 years ago. Instead, she'd been hiding money in accounts under fake names, using Lisa's stolen identities from when they were dealing together. Nathan said the judge wouldn't care about financial crimes since they were separate from custody issues. 2 days before the final hearing, CPS finally finished their investigation. The social worker called to tell me they found no evidence I'd abused Kyle, but they noted the custody situation was hurting him badly. Their official recommendation was neutral, which meant they weren't helping either side. They documented how Kyle's mental state was getting worse every day, how he'd gone from a happy kid to someone who barely talked anymore. The next morning, Kyle's teacher called while I was at work. She said they'd found $200 cash in his backpack during a routine check. Kyle told them his mommy gave him money for being good during visits. The school had to report it to CPS as possible grooming behavior, but the teacher said it was too late to affect the hearing since it was tomorrow. That night, Kyle came into my room while I was packing documents for court. He climbed onto my bed and asked if I'd still love him if he went to live with Mia. I told him yes, I'd always love him no matter what. He started crying for the first time in weeks, grabbing onto me like he used to when he was little. Then he pulled away and wiped his face, saying Mia told him not to cry because it made him look weak. The next morning, we drove to the courthouse in silence. Inside the courtroom, Mia's lawyer stood up first and painted a picture of a reformed mother who'd been denied her child by a sister who played God with the family. He showed videos from the supervised visits where Kyle was laughing and playing with Mia. Then he showed photos of Kyle looking sad at my house, all carefully picked to make me look bad. Nathan got up next and presented the USB recordings we'd gotten from the hidden camera. A tech expert testified they were real, showing Mia coaching Kyle on what to say. But Mia's lawyer argued it just showed a mother helping her son express his feelings, not manipulation. Judge Patricia sat there looking unconvinced by both sides. Rachel took the stand next and testified that Kyle showed signs of loyalty conflict, torn between two homes. She said he needed stability and recommended placement with Mia because of the biological bond and because Kyle said that's what he wanted. I sat there watching my 7 years of being his real mother get reduced to clinical terms that meant nothing. When it was my turn to testify, I told them everything about almost dying during birth, how Mia knew about the Factor V Leiden that made pregnancy deadly for me. I explained how she abandoned us right after Kyle was born, blocking all contact and disappearing to Seattle. But during cross-examination, Mia's lawyer twisted everything around. He made me sound bitter about my medical problems and jealous that Mia could have kids when I couldn't anymore. They brought Kyle in to testify last. He stood there in his little suit and gave a speech that sounded nothing like him. He said he wanted to live with his real mom, but still loved his aunt. Every word was perfectly crafted to sound mature and thoughtful, but I knew Mia had rehearsed it with him 100 times. Nathan made his closing argument about the pattern of manipulation, abandonment, and child endangerment. Mia's lawyer countered with a story about maternal rights and redemption, how everyone deserves a second chance with their child. Judge Patricia said she needed a brief recess to make her decision. We all filed out into the courthouse hallway, and I watched Mia hugging Kyle like she'd already won. The timing of that CPS visit right after Kyle's meltdown is too perfect to be luck. How did Mia know exactly when to trigger him? 20 minutes into the recess, I went to the bathroom and found Kyle sitting on the floor by the sinks, with his knees pulled up to his chest. His shoulders were shaking, and when he looked up, his face was red and wet with tears. He grabbed my hand and pulled me down next to him, whispering that Derek scared him, but Mommy said he was nice now. For just a second, the real Kyle came through, the one I'd raised for 7 years, and he begged me to make it stop. But then his whole body went stiff and he yanked his hand away, scrambling backwards while shaking his head and saying he didn't mean it. He didn't mean it. Please don't tell. Nathan found us there 5 minutes later, his phone pressed to his ear and his face white as paper. He held up one finger for me to wait while whoever was on the other end kept talking, and I watched his eyes get wider with each word. When he finally hung up, he grabbed my arm and pulled me into the hallway, checking his watch before telling me that Lisa, Derek's sister who'd been helping them, just got arrested in California Mia for identity theft. She was sitting in a jail cell right now offering to tell everything about Mia and Derek's plan in exchange for a deal. But court was starting again in 3 minutes. We rushed back to the courtroom where Judge Patricia was already taking her seat, and Nathan immediately stood up asking for permission to approach the bench. Patricia looked annoyed but waved him forward along with Mia's lawyer, and I watched them have a heated discussion with lots of hand gestures. Nathan kept pointing at his phone while Mia's lawyer shook his head, and Patricia's frown got deeper with every word. Finally, she called us all to order and said Nathan had requested a continuance to present new evidence. She was frustrated by the delays and would only consider it if the evidence was truly extraordinary. Nathan explained about Lisa's arrest and her willingness to testify about the entire scheme, how she had documents and recordings that would prove everything. Patricia sat back in her chair for a long moment before reluctantly granting 72 hours, warning that this was the absolute last delay she would allow. That evening, I was heating up leftover pasta when I heard pounding on my front door so hard the whole frame shook. Through the peephole, I saw Mia's face twisted with rage, and before I could back away, she started screaming that I ruined everything, that I was a jealous witch who couldn't stand to see her happy. I grabbed my phone and started recording while she kicked the door and yelled that she'd make Kyle hate me forever, that she'd tell him how I stole him and lied to him his whole life. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, must have called the cops because I heard sirens getting closer, while Mia kept screaming about how I was going to pay for this. The recording caught everything, including her saying she knew exactly how to hurt me most, and that Kyle would never forgive me when she was done with him. 2 officers showed up and I played them the video, showing them the restraining order on my phone, and they cuffed Mia right there on my front porch while she screamed about her rights. But she was out on bail by midnight, her lawyer calling Nathan to say the arrest was just a misunderstanding and wouldn't affect the custody case. Nathan said it didn't matter because the arrest report was now part of the court record showing her unstable behavior when cornered. Derek had vanished completely, his phone disconnected and his apartment empty when Nathan's investigator went to check. The next morning, Lisa's deposition came through and Nathan called me to his office to review it together. She'd given them everything, including photos of forged documents, recordings of coaching sessions where they taught Kyle exactly what to say, proof that Derek was still dealing drugs and using the money to pay for Mia's lawyer. But the worst part was a recording of Mia from 2 weeks ago, drunk and laughing about how she didn't actually want to raise Kyle, she just wanted to hurt me for taking him in the first place. She said having him around reminded her of everything she'd lost and she couldn't stand looking at him, but making me suffer was worth pretending to be a good mother. Lisa had recorded it all because she was tired of being dragged into their mess and wanted insurance in case they turned on her. Meanwhile, Kyle was staying with a court-appointed guardian, a retired teacher named Mrs. Patterson, who specialized in cases like this. Without Mia and Derek constantly watching him, Kyle finally felt safe enough to tell the truth. Mrs. Patterson called Nathan to report that Kyle had broken down during lunch and told her everything about Derek hitting him when he forgot his lines, about Mia screaming at him during visits when he didn't act happy enough, about being locked in his room when he cried for me. He'd drawn pictures of our old house and written, "I want to go home," over and over on the pages. 3 days later, I met with Kyle at the courthouse under supervision from a social worker. The moment he saw me, he ran into my arms sobbing and apologizing over and over, saying Mia told him I'd go to jail if he didn't say the right things in court. He kept saying he was sorry. He was so sorry. He didn't mean any of it. He just didn't want me to get in trouble. He showed me bruises on his arms from where Derek had grabbed him, and explained how they'd made him practice his testimony every night for weeks. The manipulation was worse than I'd imagined because Mia had weaponized his love for me against both of us, telling him that if he really loved me, he'd help get him back to his real family. When court resumed, Judge Patricia's face was like stone as she reviewed all the new evidence. She called Mia to the stand and questioned her directly about Lisa's testimony, asking if she'd coached Kyle to lie in court. Mia started out calm, saying Lisa was a criminal who would say anything to avoid jail. But when Patricia played the recording of Mia saying she didn't want Kyle, something snapped. Mia jumped up screaming about her rights as a mother, how Kyle was hers by blood and nobody could take that away, how the whole system was rigged against her. She pointed at me, yelling that I was a barren witch who stole her baby, and it took 2 bailiffs to get her back in her seat. Patricia ordered an immediate psychological evaluation of Mia, not Kyle, saying she had serious concerns about Mia's mental state and ability to parent. The court psychiatrist spent 3 hours with Mia and diagnosed her with narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features, recommending against any unsupervised contact with Kyle due to the high risk of emotional manipulation and psychological harm. 2 days later, Nathan called me at work to say Derek had been arrested trying to cross into Canada with 2 kilos of cocaine and 3 unregistered guns in his trunk. The border agents found fake passports too, and Derek's mugshot showed a man who looked nothing like the successful boyfriend Mia had been bragging about in court. When Nathan told Mia about Derek's arrest during our next hearing, she stood up so fast her chair fell over and started screaming at her own lawyer. She fired him right there in front of everyone and told the judge she would represent herself because everyone was conspiring against her. Patricia gave her 3 days to prepare her own case, but when we came back, Mia had brought a stack of printed emails and text messages from years ago. She waved them around saying they proved I was the one who forced her to take Kyle, that I had manipulated her into letting me be a surrogate. She pointed at Nathan and said he was sleeping with me, then turned to Patricia and accused her of taking bribes from the insurance company. When she started yelling about how Kyle had been brainwashed by me and would testify that I beat him, 2 court officers moved closer to her. She saw them coming and lunged across the aisle at me, screaming about the money I owed her for raising Kyle for 11 months. The officers grabbed her arms, but she kept kicking and spitting until they had to carry her out while she screamed that we were all going to pay. Patricia called a recess, and when we came back an hour later, Mia was in handcuffs at the defendant's table. The judge didn't waste any time with her verdict, granting me full permanent custody with no visitation rights for Mia whatsoever. She issued a permanent restraining order preventing Mia from coming within 500 feet of Kyle or me, and then she did something I didn't expect. Patricia looked straight at the prosecutor who had been sitting in the gallery and said she was referring Mia's case for criminal prosecution on charges of child endangerment, fraud, and witness tampering. Mia just stared at the table while the judge explained that Kyle would be returned to my custody immediately, and any attempt to contact him would result in immediate arrest. A week later, Kyle came home for good, but he wasn't the same kid who had been taken 3 months earlier. He kept asking if Mia could come get him again, if she still loved him, if he had been bad and that's why she was gone. Every night he woke up screaming from nightmares, and during the day he followed me from room to room like he was afraid I would disappear. I found a child therapist who specialized in parental alienation cases, and we started going twice a week. One afternoon I came home from grocery shopping and couldn't find Kyle anywhere until until I heard a small sound from his closet. He had built a fort inside with every blanket and pillow he could find, and when I opened the door, he was sitting in the middle with a flashlight and his favorite stuffed elephant. He looked up at me and whispered that no one could find him in there, that he was safe from everyone. Instead of trying to talk him out, I grabbed the Christmas lights from the garage and helped him string them up inside the fort. How did Kyle know to build that safe space in the closet? Was that something he learned to do at Mia's when things got scary? I brought his other stuffed animals one by one, and we arranged them like guards around his safe space. For 3 hours, we sat in that closet fort, not talking about Mia or court or anything scary, just reading comic books by Christmas light while the world outside stayed far away. The insurance company wasn't done with Mia either, and they filed a civil suit for the full $547,000 plus another $200,000 in damages and legal fees. With Derek in federal prison facing 15 years and Lisa testifying about everything she had seen in their apartment, Mia had no defense left. Her public defender told Nathan she was looking at 3 to 5 years in state prison just on the criminal charges, and the civil suit would follow her for the rest of her life. A month passed, and Kyle was making slow progress in therapy when Nathan called to warn me that Mia had tried something new. She had gotten a new lawyer to send a letter addressed to Kyle claiming I was poisoning him against his real mother, and that she would always love him no matter what lies he was told. Nathan intercepted it before it reached our mailbox, but Kyle saw the envelope when Nathan brought it to show me why we needed to add mail tampering to her charges. That night, Kyle's nightmares came back worse than ever, and he wet the bed for the first time in years. His therapist spent our next session explaining to Kyle that some people get sick in their thinking, like Mia, and that sick thinking makes them do things that hurt others. She used simple words to help him understand that love doesn't mean hurting someone or scaring them, and that what Mia did wasn't Kyle's fault. Kyle started to understand the difference between real love and what Mia had done to him, and he stopped asking when she was coming back. But Mia wasn't finished trying to hurt us from jail, and I found out she had been posting on forums for estranged parents, telling hundreds of strangers that I had kidnapped her son. She claimed to be a victim of the corrupt family court system, and that I had bribed judges and manipulated DNA tests to steal Kyle. The posts got shared in these echo chambers where other parents who had lost custody rallied around her story. Soon I was getting anonymous letters calling me a baby thief and threatening to expose my crimes. Nathan filed each one with the police and assured me they were legally meaningless, just angry people on the internet who didn't know the real story. 2 months after the custody trial ended, Mia faced her criminal trial via video link from county jail. She had been charged with child endangerment, fraud, witness tampering, and assault from when she attacked me in court. The prosecutor laid out everything from the fake genetic testing forms to Derek's drug dealing to the conditions Kyle had been living in. When the verdict came back guilty on all charges, the judge sentenced her to 5 years in state prison with no possibility of contact with Kyle until he turned 18. I watched on my laptop from home while Kyle was at school, and when the judge read the sentence, I didn't feel happy or vindicated, just tired down to my bones. That afternoon when Kyle got home from school, I told him Mia was going to prison for 5 years and watched his face go through about 10 different emotions before he just nodded and went to his room. The next week, his therapist called to say Kyle had asked to write a letter to Mia during their session. Not to send, but just to get his feelings out on paper. I picked him up after, and he was quieter than usual, holding a folded piece of paper he eventually threw in the trash at home without showing me. 2 days later, I found him in the backyard with a shovel, digging holes along the fence line, and when I asked what he was doing, he said he wanted to plant something that was just ours. We drove to the garden center and he picked out tomato plants and sunflowers and a little lemon tree, naming each one as we planted them together, his hands careful as he patted soil around the roots. Every morning before school, he'd water them with this old watering can we found in the garage, checking for new growth like it was the most important job in the world. His teacher called a few weeks later to tell me Kyle had stopped talking about his real mom during sharing time and was just talking about regular kid stuff like his plants and what we made for dinner. The change happened slowly over months. Him calling me Helen, then Aunt Helen again, then one day just Mom when he asked for help with homework, both of us pretending not to notice. A check arrived from the state for $15,000, the first payment from Mia's seized assets, and I opened a college account for Kyle that same day. 6 months after the trial, I woke up to smoke detector beeping and found Kyle in the kitchen trying to flip eggs that had turned into rubber while bread burned in the toaster. A card made from construction paper sitting on a tray that said, "For Mom," in green marker. His end-of-year report came home with all satisfactory marks and a note from his teacher saying he'd been standing up for a first grader who was getting picked on, using his words instead of his fists like before. During summer break, he asked if we could drive by the hospital where he was born, and we sat in the parking lot eating ice cream while he stared at the building before saying, "Thank you for not dying, Mom," his voice so quiet I almost missed it. I ran into Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store buying cat food, and she pulled me into this big hug, telling me the whole neighborhood had been keeping an eye on us, that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up with casseroles and offer to watch your kid. Kyle started 3rd grade with his head high, writing my name on every form without me having to remind him, and when they did a family tree project, he wrote, "Don't need one, my mom is enough," which made me cry in my car after pickup. His 8th birthday came on a perfect Saturday in October, the backyard full of kids from school and neighbors we'd gotten close to, everyone singing while Kyle blew out candles on a lopsided cake I'd made from a box mix. He closed his eyes to make a wish, then said out loud that he wanted everything to stay just like this. And looking around at our messy, loud, imperfect life full of people who'd chosen to love us, I realized we'd built something Mia could never understand. Not a family stolen or forced or manipulated into being, but one that grew from truth and sacrifice and showing up every day even when it was hard, even when we were both scared, even when neither of us knew what we were doing. The garden Kyle planted was taller than him now, heavy with tomatoes we'd canned for winter, and watching him hand out cake to his friends with his gap-toothed smile, I knew that everything we'd lost had somehow led us to exactly where we needed to be. Thanks for tagging along while I wondered and explored today. Seriously, it was so fun uncovering all these little details with you. Until our next adventure, subscribe for more content like this.